Welcome to Cool Talk and the history of the world. Today we talk about ancient Egypt, a story that begins 5,000 years ago, 3,000 years BCE. Think about that. Cleopatra is closer in years to our present day than she is to the original pyramids. Egypt's civilizations is actually many civilizations with highs and lows. It would rise and fall and be invaded and taken over by the Libyans, the Persians, the Greeks, and finally to the Romans. Let's begin. Egypt is called the gift of the Nile. Everybody depended on the Nile River to farm, to bathe, to drink. The hot deserts around the Nile were dry and hot and barren, but the area around the river was green and fertile. The floods of Egypt were gentle. The water rises gently, not like Mesopotamia where the floods were strong and unexpected. Perhaps this is the reason that in Mesopotamia, especially Sumer, people thought of the afterlife as hard, while in Egypt, everyone thought that the afterlife was going to be good. For a while, there were two Egypts, Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt. If you look at the map, you might be wondering, why is Lower Egypt on top? Well, that's because you're looking at a map. If you were living on the ground, you would say that Lower Egypt is north, which is where the Nile River goes. Egyptians learned to study the river. They knew that from May to October, the river would sail downstream, which means north, and then they could sail upstream in the other months with the wind. Eventually, Egypt got very, very rich, and they started trading all over Africa and the Mediterranean. Artists abounded. There was a lot of pottery and a lot of exporting of linen. There were a lot of rich merchants and nobles and many, many wealthy princes. It was nice to be a rich merchant, but can you imagine being the Pharaoh, the king? The Pharaoh was considered a god, which meant he owned the earth. He had absolute power over everybody, and everybody had to do what he said. Religion was very important to the Egyptians, and they sought a balance of order and chaos. The high priest in the temple had many rituals, dances, and sacrifices, and they bathed 4 times a day, twice in the morning and twice in the evening. Now, ancient Egyptian art may seem childlike and very simple, but that's misleading. Egyptians sought clarity and art so they could put these in the temples or buried in tombs for the afterlife. Hieroglyphics. Egyptian writing started as pictures, but then they became phonetic. This all began about 3,100 BCE. And in 3,000 years, well, languages change. It's really hard to decipher a lot of this. Let's give you an example. What you're looking at here is English, the Lord's Prayer, or as some call it, the Our Father. It's about 900 years old, and look at the changes. In 1799, the French discovered the Rosetta Stone, ancient writing, 3 languages, a Greek translation, hieroglyphics, and a later Egyptian writing called Debatic. On translating the stone, man was finally able to read the many, many records of ancient Egypt. The greatest influence, the greatest gift that the Egyptians gave us was papyri. People in the past would write on clay, but that was very tedious. Or they would get skin and make parchment. But now they would take papyri reeds, they would grow them in the marshes, take them, open up, crisscross them, smash and flatten them, and there you go, papyri. With the invention of papyri, the Egyptians were able to have abundant record keeping, but they could also write novels and stories. There were great advances in communication, in art, in trade, in the political world, in the technological world, and papyri was the best thing that ever happened in communication until the Chinese invented paper a couple of thousand years later. And by the way, the word paper comes from the word papyri. Now, most of the books written were religious, such as the Book of the Dead. The Book of the Dead was never really an assembled book, but a compilation of writings about funeral rituals and magic spells. Cats. Cats were very important. 5,000 years ago, the Egyptians used cats in the desert to chase away rodents and kill snakes. Then they kept them as pets. Eventually, they got to worship the cats, and people would be buried with mummified cats. Another feline influence, the Sphinx of Giza. With the head of a woman and the body of a lion, it faces east. It's been there for 4,500 years and has seen 1.6 million sunrises. When a pharaoh or a prince or a nobleman died, they would mummify the body, which basically means taking out all the organs and putting them in jars, embalming the body with fluids, and wrapping it with bandages. Now, they would leave the heart in the body. Because they believed that the mind was in the heart, not in the brains. They also believed that emotions came from the heart, which is probably why on Valentine's Day people give out hearts. They don't give out brains. And mummification was actually very good. Look how preserved this body is after about 3,000 years. Ramses looks good. Egyptian boys were circumcised at the age of 15 as a rite of passage to manhood. And even though Egyptians believed greatly in magic, they made great advances in medicine. They used observation techniques over long periods of time. And they had universal health care, even for the slaves. Egyptian women were very independent. They could hold administrative positions, they could be teachers, merchants, buy and sell land. It was not unusual for an Egyptian woman to go out and work while the man stayed home weaving. This is probably due to their strong bloodlines that they seeked, and also because of the cult of Isis. Egyptian mythology involves incest, castration, self-pleasure. It's a very bizarre tale with many, many gods. And if you heard the story of Cain killing Abel, well, just keep in mind that Osiris was killed by his brother Seth in a bout of jealousy where Seth dismembered Osiris. Now, the pieces of Osiris's body was put together by his wife Isis. She revived him. And they even had a son, little Horus, which is kind of strange because she never found Osiris's male organ. You might say the image of goddess Isis holding her little baby Horus is not unlike the vision of the Virgin Mary holding the baby Jesus. And the belief in this godlike family of Isis, Osiris, and Horus may have had something to do with the influence on today's Holy Trinity. Horus had the head of a falcon. Egyptians were very big on animal images. The god of the underworld, Anubis, had the head of a dog, and when you died, he would put your heart on a scale against the weight of a feather. If your heart weighed less than the feather, you got to go to the afterlife. Now, Horus lost his eye in battles with his uncle Seth, and you can see the influence of this image everywhere, the eye of Horus. You can see it on the yin-yang symbol. You see the symbol on the dollar bill and in several movies like The Lord of the Rings and Clockwork Orange. This is a mummified baboons. Egyptians would keep baboons as pets. They would train them to be waiters and even bathroom attendants. This is the god Bes, very popular. He was a dwarf, and women would tattoo their upper thigh with his image, sort of like a good luck charm. Egyptians were big on tattoos. Egyptians wore no clothes. They walked around naked until they were 6 years old. They got married at 12, but there was no marriage ceremony. There were, however, legal divorces. Adultery was illegal and very frowned upon. Egyptian sexual practice were perverted by today's standards. It was like anything goes as long as you were monogamous. Now, incest, however, was very prevalent among the royal family, but was not so popular among the common people. Both men and women wore makeup, heavy makeup, eyeliner, wigs, and tattoos. Everybody drank beer, even the children, but it was not very intoxicating. It was thick and soupy. Egyptians practiced birth control. They would create condoms out of sheaths of cow gut. They would use honey and milk to put concoctions together. Women would put crocodile dung on their private parts. Ugh. Egyptians worked very hard. When they were not farming, out of season, they would raise buildings, pyramids, and temples. Egyptians believed in magic potions. If you wanted someone to fall in love with you, well, you mix together some cow milk, nail clippings, urine, and honey, say a couple of incantations over it, and that was it. You had a magic potion. Now, all you had to do is get that person you're in love with to drink it. In observing how plants would die and come back, they believed in an afterlife. They believed that creation began when land appeared out of the water. So their burial grounds looked like tombs that were heaps, like land coming out of the sea. And this was where the idea of the pyramid came. Now, the kingdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt were united by the pharaoh Menes, or Narmer as we know him. Menes was the first recorded pharaoh in history. He reigned for about 60 years and then died when he was attacked by a hippopotamus. Now, the kingdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt each had their own crown, but when Menes united the regions, he put the two crowns together. Now, even though the pharaoh was supreme leader, high priests acquired great power, and merchants became rich in their own right. A class system fell into place. And the high priest created a ritual. When they considered a pharaoh too old to rule, they said it was time for the pharaoh to go to the afterlife. So they promised the leader a happy future, killed him, and said they would kill his servants too, so they could serve the pharaoh in the heavens. They even held a festival commemorating the event with processions and sacrifices. Eventually, a pharaoh said, "I don't think so," and he began centralizing his power with huge armies and riches. His troops decided that the pharaoh should have the high priest killed too, so they could also serve him in the heavens. Well, that changed things. From then on, the pharaohs died naturally, and when he did, only statues of servants and high priests were put in the tombs with him. At first, pharaohs were buried with their treasures under stone heaps inside buildings. That is, until Pharaoh Zoser commissioned the architect Imhotep to build something a little grander, a tomb with underground tunnels and networks to keep grave robbers away. So 1,000 laborers built the first pyramid, and it was a stair pyramid. Eventually, pyramids changed into this shape, and when a pyramid was brand new, it looked like this: smooth white surfaces with a capstone, and the capstone could be seen from miles around, reflecting the sun. The capstone, or called the pyramidion, was made of gold, limestone, or bronze. You can see some of these pyramidions today in several museums. Then the pyramids got larger. Now Pharaoh Khufu, or Cheops as some called him, had 100,000 workers work for 20 years to build his pyramid. All of this so he could be remembered. But when he died, the people hated him so much they wouldn't refer to the pyramid as Khufu's pyramid. They call it Philiti's pyramid. And Philiti was a local shepherd. This could not last. Egypt struggled under the economic burden, and then came Pharaoh Pepi II. Pepi became pharaoh at 6 years old, and he ruled for 94 years. As Pharaoh Pepi grew older and more feeble, he delegated power away to different assigned representatives. These regional representatives of the king were called nomarchs, and they increased their influence and wealth. Pharaoh Pepi had several wives. 2 of them were half-sisters, and 1 was a granddaughter. Gross, I know. But Egyptians believed in keeping the bloodline pure, and if the gods practiced incest, why not them? Pepi died a week-old man, age 100. He had decentralized his power, and after he died, civil war broke out. Then came the Hyksos, a population from Canaan. They invaded Egypt, frightening the Egyptians with their chariots and their horses. The Hyksos worshipped Baal, brought to Egypt the bow and arrow, the horse, the chariot, new techniques in bronze making. But then came Pharaoh Amhos from Thebes, who drove the Hyksos out and re-established Egypt. Some years later, Thutmose II became king, but he was weak and allowed his wife Hatshepsut to control him. When Thutmose died without a male heir, his wife Hatshepsut dressed like a man and became Pharaoh. She was supposed to step aside when her nephew was old enough to take over, but she decided, hey, it's good to be the king, so she stayed. Hatshepsut reigned for 20 years, a time of peace, great trade, advances in seafaring, and rebuilding of monuments. When she died, her nephew took over and brought 30 years of war. When Akhenaton became pharaoh, he, possibly to consolidate his power tied to the high priest of the sun god Ra, banned all other religions. He wanted them to practice monotheism. Well, this didn't last, and the people resented it. When his son Tutankhamun became pharaoh, he returned Egypt to its traditional ways, and perhaps this is why, in gratitude, he was buried with so many treasures. He died at 19, possibly from malaria. Then came Ramses the Great, who reigned for 67 years, a warrior king who led the troops into Canaan, Nubia, Syria, Libya, and tried to fight the Hittites in the famous Battle of Kadesh. He defeated the Sheridan pirates who had been attacking his sea routes. He raised temples, statues, and monuments all over Egypt. This is the period where Egypt becomes an empire. And under Ramses, there was a first recorded labor strike in history. It was due to food shortages. You see, the plants in Egypt were not getting enough sunlight, and some believe it was due to a volcanic eruption in Iceland. Traditionally, people believe that Ramses was the same pharaoh that bickered with Moses in the Bible in the book of Exodus. Some historians are now saying that it could have been Pharaoh Thutmose, that was Hatshepsut's husband, whose reign only lasted 13 years. The kingdom collapsed. He died without a male heir, and when they saw his mummy, it was filled with scabs. After a few hundred years, however, the Egyptian empire, under the exhaustive war efforts, the kings losing ground to the nomarchs, well, there was economic troubles and other civilizations would rise. They would invade and conquer the Libyans, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans. The Egyptian empire was no more. Let's do a quick summary. In the first 400 years, Menes unites Egypt. He establishes Memphis as the capital. Hieroglyphics help advance record-keeping and writing. The next 400 years, the Old Kingdom and the Age of Pharaohs. The worship of the sun god Ra is widespread. The next 175 years, economic downfall and famine. Egypt is again divided in two. 300 years, the Middle Kingdom. Mentuhotep reunites Egypt. Again, irrigation projects are abundant. The next 90 years, the nobles of the pharaohs bicker. The Hyksos invade and introduce the horse and chariot. The next 400 years, the new kingdom. Amos takes back Egypt. The kingdom prospers, invades other nations, and creates an empire. In the next 700 years, Egypt weakens and is conquered by the Assyrians, the Persians, and in 332 BCE by Alexander the Great. Ptolemy, a Greek, would become the new pharaoh, and in 30 BCE, Cleopatra, under Roman threat, commits suicide. She would be the last pharaoh. So what is Egypt's legacy? Well, Egypt could have been even more influential if it wouldn't have been an isolationist kingdom. Egypt's ancient history, however, is measured in millenniums. Despite the ups and downs, it's endured, outlasting most civilizations. And it's the power of the imagination. Egypt, for better or worse, showed the world what one people can do with unity and a common purpose. No one could have imagined the extent of the infrastructure that it built at that time. Egypt fascinates with its strange alien beliefs and with gods with animal heads, its perverse and mysterious practices. After 2,000 years of being conquered, just 100 years ago, Egypt regained its independence and is one of the most powerful nations in the Middle East today. We will revisit Egypt when we study Rome and Cleopatra. There will also be a video on ancient African empires of that time. But first, we're going to study the ancient Greeks. But until then, thanks for watching. This is Cool Talk.